If you would like, because of the small numbers, we would invite you to come down, sit with us, rather than. And I'd like to introduce the panel to you first. Again, they have been with us yesterday as facilitators, workshops, and agreed today and conference. Brandon Keaton, attorney, not going to extend addictions before, but Brandon, very active, various forms. See justice in depth. He is a person who has chosen the profession of law. Last night she was telling us how hard she had to read, and then she chose public service. Engaged in legal action, public service. Interestingly enough, Ray chosen a similar path. Both become attorneys, accomplishing of doesn't themselves Wall Street attorneys. They have devoted their life to public service. Ray is involved with Mediation group Chicago, involved in a number of concerns and issues, social justice, and chosen that public service over. Then we have Luis Miranda. This is a graduate of here. We're proud of him. Involved in work with the Sierra Club. Again, very active advocate. As we move on to I can wait. One of the things that I find conference, I hear a lot of really impressive ideas, fundamental sorts of things that excite me. And when the conference is over, I do what Omar Khayyam once lamented. That was often doctor saying great argument about this and our hope in this panel, thus, what do we do? Often conference marvelous, motivate. What do we interest? Heard this quoted several times. Recognize important thing about that statement, not a period after comma. Comma says less. Here the idea, on this panel, active followed. Here grade. Like to do. Might be.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Lynn. And it's very good to be back here. I remember presenting here as an undergrad a couple times, having lunch on a table like this with like the International Relations Club, eating Little Caesars pizza that we got from, I don't know, of course. 'Cause I don't think the pizza on campus was like, don't tell that to the services. But just so that you understand, I have some little points and remarks to give around how the work of healing conversations is looking like, at least for me personally in my own work here locally and regionally. But before jumping into that, just to have a bit of context, after graduating from the program here, and thank you, Dr. Minch, for the deep transformation you had in my life. I took 4 courses with you. I've spent time with the Peace Research Institute Oslo, doing some work around peace research in the Caucasus. I've done some academic work around in the London School of Economics around the imperial nature of conflict resolution, and how Western powers will create both the very same problem and the solutions to that problem, and institutionally how we get there. But my emphasis a lot has been actually, when I got really deep into it, is like, I don't really want to do academics. I actually want to be out in the street. And that's what's led me to do work in Colombia. When I was in Colombia, I was with the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace as part of the Kroc Institute. And my work there had a lot to do with working with people in rural spaces, the peace builders, the people on the ground who are taking the leadership, and us figuring out what our role is, being in institutions with resources and letting them be the protagonists of their own conflict, and also working with social movements. And today, I do organizing around the immigration justice movement here locally. I'm also with the Sierra Club. And for me, it was a very interesting shift, because it was like, I've studied all those peace building stuff and I've done these things. And I'm like, but hey, look at what's happening in our country. We definitely need us spending that energy and investing that energy in moral imagination here. And that led me back to Utah, where now I'm working with the Bianco campaign, and I'm trying to address questions of, we have in eastern Utah just a huge industry and history of mining, coal that is being burned, livelihoods that are dependent on that, polarization between rural and urban communities. And in fact, tonight I'm heading there. So by the end of the evening, I'll be in eastern Utah. And as somebody working for an environmentalist organization, I'm not welcome very much in that space. So there is a lot of work to be done, even before we can talk about what the future can look like in terms of just building those basic relationships, a lot like what Duncan was mentioning throughout his remarks. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I use the skills in order to be able to organize for justice, but in that process also transform as an environmental movement to do the soul searching around our own accountability for the racism, colonization, exclusion that we've caused, separation that we've caused, but also supporting the healing of the people with whom we are in beloved community. People that may not necessarily support the existence of my family in this country, right? But then I know deep inside they're also children of God within my own ethic, right? But they're human love. And so just a few things to mention. One is like, in terms of going from here, I think we're exploring recently a lot the conversation of healing conversations being more than just an interpersonal thing, but being like a fractal. There's an inward turn that we're experiencing towards mindfulness and some inner work. Those of you that were able to participate in the session that I did, the first half we just did shadow work, right? which is inner work on understanding the things that we may loathe about ourselves and learning to become comfortable with that. But also we can go beyond the interpersonal into the community level conversations by direct actions. What does doing a direct action that invites healing look like, right? Where we humanize the other at the same time while we're confronting. And so if people are interested in that, I suggest like literature like my friend Kazuhaga has this book called Healing Resistance that could be really interesting for those of you interested in how we integrate healing into more than just the person-to-person conversations, but into all these different aspects of our lives as a fractal. The other thing that we're really managing right now is that paradox for the need for safety for healing, right? It's really hard to want to heal if you have a gun on your head or if your life is in threat. But also, at the same time, if we want to use nonviolence, it's also inadequate at keeping people alive, right? And this is a big debate we've been having recently around Ukraine. What do you do? I mean, if my family's about to be killed for no just reason even whatsoever, like, well, there's no just reason. I can't imagine, right? But like, what do you do, right, when extermination is imminent? And so, as East Point Peace Academy, I'm a core team member there. We released a statement, just like acknowledging the inadequacies of nonviolence, and also as a historical tradition has brought us here, but it's also not the tradition as it is and it has been, the one that will lead us into the future. Our job as a vibrant community is to actually reinvent and reimagine what that looks like for us today, and continue to, do this work on the shoulders of the giants that came before us. But again, it hasn't been sufficient for that. But while we know that nonviolence is not going to stop the war and extermination, we also know that nonviolence is going to be necessary for truth, reconciliation, to build trust again. And that's also what we're seeing as well on the ground. I don't have answers. There's a contradiction, there's a paradox here that we're trying to deal with in those spaces. And I want to make note as well of like even the George Floyd protests that happened in 2020 or even before, when there's like buildings being burned. There's like this double standard that happens of like, oh, but we need to be more, pacifist about this. But like when people of color, people like myself and my family who have been incarcerated, feel like our lives, we're being hunted, like what do we do, right? And so we're trying to do healing work, but then how do you do healing work while also trying to fight for your safety? On the other side of this is also the cost of shame. Shame is something that in social movements, it's very powerful tool. Shame is great at disrupting, right? And particularly is powerful for asymmetric conflicts where there's marginalized groups that just don't have access to power and can't really quite level the field. And so it's very helpful to disrupt whatever is happening. The problem is it also has a cost. And that cost can sometimes be, well, it becomes a defensiveness. It disrupts, but we also need the other people with whom we're in community to be willing to commit to that transformation. Another point to bring up is also we're working through the question of decolonizing our theory and practice. Again, I think I've done some work around acknowledging just a peace-building industrial complex. When we say industrial complex, we mean that there's like a manufactured supply and demand, and it's more virtual and it's more of a story and narrative that I think we carry, but also has material consequences that both the Western powers, like Kate was mentioning in the previous session with your question, Western powers, we've done a great job, particularly in the United States, to generate conflict, instability, instigate issues in other places, but then we also become the industry where we get hired to go ahead and solve them. There's something odd about that, and I say that as somebody who's worked as a person from the United States in international contexts, like India and Colombia, and I'm like, I'm teaching people in India about nonviolence. This is kind of odd. I'm doing peace building work in Colombia. This is kind of odd. We have to also deal with the Christian roots of peace. There's like all this universe of stories, of metaphors that are very helpful and beautiful for us. I say this as a Christian person whose Christian faith animates his activism. But there's also other epistemologies, and there's times in which that just becomes inadequate, right? So how do we decolonize our theory and practice? And I think there's a lot of beautiful things happening. There's a lot of wisdom coming from the Black community, things that we're seeing already. Like Tema Okun's work around like white supremacy culture. I see that a lot in workplaces over the past year or two. Here in Utah, we had the Utah Conversations on Anti-Blackness, which was an effort led by community organizers to bring folks from Black and non-Black backgrounds to talk about anti-Blackness in themselves. We have work around decolonizing nonviolent communications, and how does it look like to then make that intertraining. There's a lot of wisdom coming from indigenous communities as well here locally, like the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women movement that has been hosting, hearings in the Nayland, etc., to try to do listening with each other around this. Or also reading books like Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, right? And looking into different ways of conceptualizing what is. So I would say also another thing that we're working towards more, to the point that you were making as well earlier in your initial remarks, is how do we spread this out so it's happening more often in more places, in more localized contexts. So as the East Point Peace Academy, we're trying to continue to explore the training of trainers idea, right? How do we keep training people to go ahead and do this work, but not necessarily like have to be the one that does it. The problem with the experts is that then we only trust these folks to go ahead and do it. But when we get people from those conflict contexts that are happening in Salt Lake City or happening in Oakland, wherever it is, taking ownership over this, now they know, and now they can go ahead and continue spreading that around. I'll mention one more, just a couple more things. I'll try to be quick, but just we also working through the question of more healing of healers. And I say this because one of my inspirations for being here is Dr. Michael Minch and your mentorship. But also, I want to honor, this has been mostly like a private thing, but I felt like I have my participation here is also commemorating my friend and colleague Jude Ash, who was a scholar of peace and psychology at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, who was a colleague, who was a friend, a fantastic karaoke partner, at times a roommate, who survived months of torture during the civil resistance in Syria and decided to dedicate his life towards healing. And tomorrow will be 1 year since we lost him, took his life. We need to also care for the healers too. I am doing this work because I also need that healing. It's out of necessity. And so I remember actually yesterday after the last panel that we did, after like 5.5 hours of like doing this work, I was like, I am super exhausted. I'm feeling weird. And I remember a very sweet moment with Duncan and also with Carl, where I was like, okay, I guess I'm leaving. I'm gonna just give you a handshake, and they're like, oh, come on, just give us a hug. And then you gave me a little bit of a pep talk. We need to continue to figure out what our practices look like to support one another. A great example of that is the Faith Matters Network and their movement chaplaincy work in ways that they're supporting people that are doing community healing. That's Reverend Jim Bailey, and that's another thing that people can check out if they're interested. I'm gonna stop there so we can have space for conversation. But yeah, I'll just again say I'm doing this, and I'm doing this because I'm obsessed with it, because I need it, and I think as you think about why this is something that is important for you, I think personalizing it will make a huge difference on how deeply you choose to go into it, and also the commitment to then, at those moments where it's like, do I really need to talk to that group? Do I really need to talk to those people that don't want me in their community coming through and having conversations with them? And going back to that beloved community, that in fact, seeing Jesus in the eyes of the enemy, seeing an extension of myself in them. So anyways, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you for sharing a story about your colleague and friend. That's really powerful, and it actually like sort of sets me up nicely for one of the first things that I want to name. which is like that idea of healing the healers, right? So the question, Lynn said, get ready to answer, talk for 10 minutes about what are we going to do next? What do we do now? What are the next steps, right? And I work at the Center for Conflict Resolution in Chicago, where we're Chicago's community mediation center. We've been around since 1979. That's a long time. That's a lot of mediations. We mediate over 1,500 cases every year, and we're able to do that using a core of about 180 certified volunteer mediators who give their time to supporting people and having focused and productive conversations about all different types of conflict in their life. And one part of our model at CCR that I'm so proud of and that I think is replicable when we're talking about this kind of work is that we brief and debrief every case. So anyone who comes in to do work, anyone who comes in to volunteer their time, they come in half an hour before the parties are going to be there so that the case manager can prepare them for the case and see where they're at. It doesn't happen a lot, but every once in a while someone will show up and they're actually not in a good place to take the case. I am thinking in particular of a volunteer who was an emergency room nurse and had lost a patient the night before and just wasn't in a good place, right? But she was volunteering, felt like she really needed to give her time, didn't want to let us down, and we were able to look at her and say, you actually aren't in the space to create the container to do this work, and you're wonderful, and you should go rest, right? And so sometimes healing the healer and sometimes doing the work is not doing the work, is knowing when to not do the work. And so and then we also have a part of our model where after every case, we debrief the case. And it doesn't matter who's mediating. If I'm mediating, the executive director is mediating. She's been with the agency for 17 years. If she takes a case, she's going to talk about it. I don't care if she does a 30-minute eviction mediation. We really, really believe in that. And what's happening there is that the secondary trauma impacts the mediator, right? And the emotional contagion is really real. And I feel like if we don't do something with all that energy after we've been in the room with folks, I always say it gets stuck in my belly. I mediated a case with a juvenile who'd been arrested for stealing a car 12 and a half years ago. And I still think about him. Right? I've talked about it a million times, but I still think about him. And so I think really making the space to do the work well is critical, and something that it took me years of practicing to learn to actually believe, to make the space and take space. And for me, the way that shows up is in allowing for there to be fallow times. Right? So it sometimes means that in the overarching progress of the work, there has to be time for rest, but rest without retreat. Right? So we've come this far and I need to stop and I need to regroup. Right? And for me, that might be something as simple as I know we've done this program for 20 years, but maybe we should, before we expand it, we should sit down and see if it's working. Right? And sometimes, that looks like, am I in the right place to take a case today or make this call, right? If I hear that one of my case managers, and honestly, this is a real challenge in virtual work because we can't hear each other on the phone, but when we share space in the office, you can hear when someone is not doing great on the phone, even just trying to do intake with someone or support them through an assessment. And it might mean saying, why don't you transfer that call to me, right? It might mean just doing that work might mean also recognizing when other people don't have everything they need to move forward. Also, I think honoring fallow times means reading. Read Braiding Sweetgrass, then read it again. I've read it, and I keep buying it to read it again, and then someone's like, I was reading that book, and I just give it away. I'm gonna fill my trunk with them. But if you and I've written down 5 books today that were recommended. Read the books, absorb, and listen. Right, that's still the work. That's part of the work, and that's the thing to do now. It's the thing to do next, and it's the thing to remember to continue to take time to do. I think always be learning is a really important place to be, even when you end up in leadership and power. If you happen to be the kind of person that's in a position where you are deciding where funds go, please fund things that work. As a person who begs professionally for money a lot, there's a phenomenon where funders want to fund new initiatives. And I'm like, but it works. Look at it working. And they're like, give it a new name, right? You got to repackage it, right? And so I think putting resources into things that are successful is really important. And also, don't be not to be important. It's important as practitioners to not be weighed down by our previous successes, right? Where I work, we were funded in the late 70s. I imagine it was an awesome time. I was not available to help create the organization, but I think there's value in looking at how do we see things now? What are the lenses that we operate from now? That where we need maybe a refresher on some of our values or approaches, things like that. And more practically, when we're talking about the work of building a project or a program, which is where a lot of my experience is, I think we have to figure out who needs to be in the conversation. And they might not be able to be in conversation with each other, but they might be able to be in conversation. And there's been a lot of talk today about sort of like being in polarizing places. I think then that's absolutely true. But I also really want to highlight the idea that has been lifted up a number of times around storytelling, right? And for me, storytelling runs to this really important value of engaging individuals with lived experience if you are going to serve them. Nothing about us without us, right? I just think that's so critical. And I have designed and run programs where we did not have that as part of the establishment, and they didn't work. They didn't work well. They were so much harder, When you walk into a community and you say, I've got this, look at this rad thing, and you really are. And I think that one of the things that we can learn from each other is that we can learn from what other programs have done and done well, and take what's gonna serve us and our communities, right? Because something is like really effective in, a suburb of Boston or Salt Lake City does not mean it is going to work in a particular neighborhood of Chicago. And because something works in one neighborhood of Chicago does not mean it is going to work in the next door neighborhood of Chicago, right? Like we have to make sure that the work that we're doing is really responsive to the community we serve on like a granular level. I've had programs be really successful in relationship with one school in one community, and a school and community of the same demographic was like, no thanks, not interested at all. Don't even want you to come talk to us about it, right? And making the space for that. And I think another piece of that, though, when trying to engage folks with lived experience, I had the privilege of being on a learning community with the National Association for Community Mediation from 2018 to 2020, where we were focusing on people living with housing insecurity. And one of the things that we did was hold listening sessions for advocates, but then also listening sessions for lived experience community members. But if you're doing that, you don't try to find people who are currently experiencing housing insecurity, right? They are like in the heart of the trauma, and asking them to come share their story with you so you can build them resources is not an act of service, right? It's the wrong time to get that information. And so going to being able to find the pathways and the connections to get folks who had been through the experience was like really fundamental for me. And then it's actually really become an integral practice to how we build and design and even analyze our pre-existing programs at CCR. I wanted to name too that one of the things that's helpful for me to remember is that even asking people to engage in conflict one-on-one in these teeny ways is a huge ask. It's just a huge ask. And Sarah uses the word miraculous a lot to describe, the projects, these big projects, but I feel like that's how I feel about when parents who used to want to date and now don't want to talk to each other are willing to sit down in a room and make a plan for their kid, right? Like we're asking so much for people to figure out what's important to them, share it with the other party, and then listen to what is important to the other person. And that's just the beginning of a conversation, right? And that's a big requirement for a lot of this work to feel successful. And so I think it's also helpful to maintain a perspective that sometimes all we're gonna do is move the conversation forward. The thing we might be able to do today might be really hard. There might be heartbreak, there might be tears. And the only thing that might come out of it is that we got to tell our story or get some new information. And that's still the work, and it's still really, really important. And then the last thing I want to share for how to actualize some of this is I was at an event years ago, and I'm so disappointed that I don't know who was speaking because I was too far from the stage. But there was a woman speaking, and she was a woman of color, and she was talking about like race and racism in America and its impact. And she said, and all you white women, you got cousins to talk to. And I was like, oh no, I have cousins to talk to, right? And so like, and so I think it's helpful to remember that if you're not sure where to start, some of this work starts at home, right? It starts in the communities that we came from. It starts with our families of origin, like opening dialogues with people who you love and who love you, not necessarily in order to change minds, but in order to practice these practices. So I'm gonna wrap up there, but I'm sure there'll be more to say soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Ray. I just busted out into that smile because when I was making my little notes about what would I say during this 10 minutes, I was thinking, go get your cousins. And so Ray just said that for me. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you. Thank you so much to the organizers for putting on this beautiful event and for all of you who are here with us in person and online. My law school loans notwithstanding, which Lynn invoked at the beginning of this session, like Louise, I really deeply wanted to be out in the streets with the people, shifting the balance of power from as long as I can remember. And I went to law school actually because I did not know where to begin. So I thought, well, if I'm going to change the laws, maybe I should know more about them. I ended up finding an organization accidentally, on purpose, by talking to a stranger in a Kmart, which is a story for another day. So in that organization, I was all fired up when I got started to get out on the streets and like do some big marches. And my mentor said, here's a phone. You're gonna call some people. And then also invited me to learn how to share my personal story. Oh, I forgot to start my egg timer. I'm gonna do that. Invited me to learn to share my personal story. And then I went and knocked doors in public housing complexes and in marginalized communities and talked to people one-to-one and learned really quickly that it's actually a lot harder in some ways to create a practice around engaging vulnerably with people one-to-one than it is to go out and grab a sign or a drum and march on the streets. And also, to my surprise, it's a lot more transformative. So I want to try to tie a few threads together that we've talked about over the course of these 2 days that have come up repeatedly. One is around movement building, another is around storytelling, the third is around curiosity, the fourth is around humanization, and the fifth is how do we engage in a way that's truly inclusive so that all of our communities are not just represented, but are as safe and in equitable relationship as they can be when doing this work. I am, in addition to having a legal background, I'm a community organizer by background. I've worked at the intersection of community organizing, stakeholder engagement, and behavioral science for the last 20 years. And as a community organizer, I'm going to ask you to get your pens, pencils, or typing fingers ready, because I have some concrete next steps for you. All right, so Michael started us off today with an incredible talk that lined out the dire straits that we are in. And yet, we are all hopeful. Yesterday, at the end of the day, we were like, we're so hopeful. So how can these two things coexist? I think of this moment in our democracy sort of like, in many moments in our democracy, historically, our American republic / democracy / thing that's trying to be a democracy, like a snake rubbing its, like when the skin gets too tight and it starts to rub up against a tree or anything it can get near to get the skin off, and it outgrows its skin, right? Our democracy, to Michael's earlier point about like, when do we actually start calling it a democracy? Because it wasn't actually for everyone when it started. to that point, we have had inflection points that were not easily traveled in the history of our democracy, where it was extended to more and more people. And now we're seeing cracks illuminated by COVID and by other events that have been sort of underneath the surface all along, I would say. And we're at a moment when that snake needs to shed its skin again. And I'm really hopeful that when it does, we're going to have the most inclusive democracy we've had in the history of our country. But how do we get there? So number one, I think, is acknowledging the toughness and discomfort of healing conversations. It's been a subtext that they're not soft. They're actually really difficult and potentially really transformative. And Duncan yesterday made this really brilliant comment among his many brilliant comments, and the many brilliant comments of all the panelists here, which was that healing conversation assumes a wound. And I would also say that the necessity of healing conversations, that they're not just like automatically happening, right? Like if this was easy, people would be running around having healing conversations, and we wouldn't need like a whole 2-day conference about it in academic fields to learn them, and hundreds and thousands of organizations working on it. People would just be doing it. Okay, so we need to acknowledge the difficulty, that they're not soft, that they're a practice that needs to be learned, and they're a practice that's transformative. Number two, okay, when we know that, what do we do next? Okay, this really hard thing. Awesome. Do I want to do that, or would I like to eat a Twinkie and watch Netflix? So the next thing is to think about, how am I going to get the skills to do this well? How can I support myself? How can I get the community to learn how to go talk to my cousins and to learn how to go talk to strangers as well? And so there's a whole community out here of trainers like myself, like Becca, like Pedro, like the beautiful people on this panel, like the professors who organized this, the Michaels, and Lynn, to help train you in different ways depending on what interests you. I will let you know that there is a coalition called Listen First of over 400 organizations with different ways to get involved. My organization, here's where the pen comes in handy, or the typing fingers, is called Unify, and it's spelled funny. It's YOUNIFY. And if you add a .org, you can find us on the internet and sign up to be involved. If you put my name in front of an @ and type unify.org, you can send me an email, and I will connect you with any of these organizations. We also have a large-scale event coming up, which is a point of entry event to finding all these different organizations. It's online. You can do it in your PJs. It's called America Talks, and you can find that at americatalks.us. That is an online event where we match you with an algorithm with somebody from different backgrounds and beliefs, and provide a conversation guide for you to have a conversation in. It feels like a Zoom room, basically. You can do it one-to-one or with a small group. And it's a super easy way to dip your toe in the water. That's the first event at the front end of the National Week of Conversation, where you can find hundreds of events from over 100 organizations. So again, that's at americatalks.us. And over 78% of people who have participated in that event find more common ground with the people that they talk with than they expect. So these conversations are possible, and they are enjoyable. Okay, so the next thing is to think about your own circle. We talked yesterday in my workshop about confirmation bias. We naturally seek out settings in which our existing beliefs will be confirmed, right? We auto-silo ourselves because our bodies are trained to auto-silo ourselves. It's a behavioral science thing, to protect ourselves, right? So we need to actually consciously think about our circle and who is different from me in my circle or my set of circles. And if there's nobody different, then it's time to think about, how could I find some different people? One way is connecting with the organizations and events that I mentioned. Another way is thinking about your community and adjacent people that you know. And then once you've had that thought, finding your place to start Could be engaging with an organization like I mentioned. It could be doing something creative locally. Like, what's fun? What's the world that we want to live in? Imagine what it would be like if we didn't have all this gnarly polarization and need for healing conversations. What would that feel like? There's a group called Color of Change that asked itself that question and started organizing events instead of around all the extremely difficult justice issues that we need to work on around Black joy. And what would it look like to have Black joy, right? We can address really difficult issues joyfully. And I would argue to the points around protecting ourselves as organizers and as healers and being responsible to the communities that we're organizing, we actually must. Okay. So, our movement building, I would say, requires storytelling. The magic of storytelling and why it's not just like a soft thing or a fun thing or a nice to have thing or a heartwarming thing. It is all of those things. But why it's actually a hardcore transformative change thing is because stories executed well expose our values. And if we expose our values, we can come together with anybody, no matter what the surface differences are. We all, underneath it all, if we dig deep enough, share values, share hopes and dreams. And there's an art and a science to exposing that in an intentional way as an organizing tool. So storytelling and movement building aren't two different things. They're actually the same thing. Engaging curiosity is a key to going from that story and those shared values to then, like, what do we do next, right? There's got to be a bridge to what do we do next. So getting curious helps expose the shared values, and it helps actually build that bridge to shared action. It also helps build trust and get around those surface differences. So I'm going to give you a really practical thing to do when you go talk to your cousins. When you go talk to your cousin, and your cousin Ed is like, says the polar opposite thing to what you want to hear, right? That thing that creates that moment when your shoulders go up and become earrings and your arms wrap around yourself like this, and your body immediately wants to tell cousin Ed like the 8 to 12,000 things that are wrong about cousin Ed that just said, and the 8 to 12,000 facts that, like, cousin Ed would be so much better off if he just knew. Instead, put your shoulders down, take a deep breath, and say, tell me more. How does that affect you and your family? That must be really frustrating. Now, there's a key to this question of why it's so magic of how does that affect you and your family. It's because it takes the whole conversation out of the TV talking points, out of the MSNBC versus Fox, or out of the me versus you, or out of what I read in my white paper, and it puts it into our own real lived experience. And if we start there with our lived experience, we're going to get on a pathway, if we keep going and keep being curious and keep being non-judgmental, to where we can come together on those shared values and take shared action. The last thing I will say, as you did hear my egg timer ding, is that we are building place-based neighborhood teams all across the country that bring people together across differences, including right here in Utah. So if that is something you would like to engage with, if you are like me before I found the dude in the Kmart, again, please reach out and we'll get you connected up with one of the many wonderful organizations that can help you find your point of entry.
Excellent. Now, we'd like to bring you in and invite you to enter modes. One is to ask questions for the panel and audience. The other is to make your own comments and suggestions. So we'll turn it to you now and comment you.
Louise, thank you so much for sharing about the healing of the healers. I think that's something that is increasingly coming into the conversation. So I think practitioners are finally, after years and years of peace building and mediation practice, going, okay, what kind of consequences does this have for us personally? I just finished a bit of research with 26 women peace builders from 5 global regions. And what came out completely clearly from that research was that people are deeply, deeply, deeply personally impacted by their work, and that there's a huge amount of secondary trauma, but that also people can still perform their work really well. And so it's this double-edged sword where the practitioners just keep keeping on, and at the same time, they're often getting more and more impacted. And so some of these women had beautiful ideas for what maybe could work, but the sad part is many of those things don't exist yet. So I suppose my question for you is, have you seen examples of some of those supportive spaces or, kind of larger scale systemic pieces of work or opportunities that practitioners can come into or access to support each other or to gain some support for themselves? And I just wondered, have you seen any of those things in operation in the US or in any of the international contexts where you work?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Sarah. And I'm hearing, that question or concern for those that are doing healing work, that you get into it and then it's hard on you, but then you still keep doing more. And how do you care for yourself? I think there's been, at least generationally speaking, millennials and Generation Z have been talking a lot about self-care. There's plenty of trends around it online, which is not to say that it's like having another human being you're talking to, but at least it's a normative reminder that you should be caring for yourself. And it also can be a pedagogical tool in terms of like learning things you can do, right? We talk about polyvagal theory and like, hey, seek therapy and whatnot. I know that there's efforts, particularly with communities of color, to find, and also queer communities too, to provide therapy services. Particularly somatic practices are very helpful with people that have experienced deep trauma, because we talk a lot about the stories and sometimes is really becomes more about just feeling. So EMDR, IFS, and other mindfulness-based practices are helping people to feel and stay with that discomfort. I've seen, I think I mentioned like the Faith Matters Network. I actually participate a little bit with it. They have movement chaplains, so you can, if you were interested in it, you can actually sign up for it. And then schedule a time to meet with them. And it's somebody who's also been doing community organizing work, but is just there to hold space for you to kind of just get it out. But as I'm saying all that and all those wonderful resources, and of course, joy, making movement and space in the movement for joy and for other things. But I'm just curious in myself, right, when that happens, where I almost feel like I will get more engaged in doing healing work as a way to avoid what I'm actually feeling. And I'm concerned at times that I use it as a tool to avoid feeling, and that in fact I'm modeling something that will in fact get in the way of the work. And so I think there's this question about modeling. I know that I've had a lot of friends who are like whenever somebody is like, I don't know if I can attend this meeting, everybody reacts like, we are so happy you're making space for yourself. That's great, right? In I've had conversations like that this week at work, like you were mentioning, right? Over like, I don't think I can have this meeting right now. Can we move this meeting? And so I think systemically some of those things are happening. I'm not, I think it's happening. I'm just, I'm curious about whether the ways that we're thinking about it are starting to build more nuance into them.
That's such an important question. We often say in organizing that you can't organize others if you aren't organized yourself, which implies some level of being a whole human. And yet, in organizing, the culture historically has been the opposite of that. We have a reward system around underpay and overwork that is not just bad for our individual human bodies, it's extractive and bad for our movements. And it's actually a symptom of a larger power imbalance, right? And this goes back to actually Ray's mention. So I'm going to take this from both a systemic and an individual. This goes back to what Ray was saying about, like, if you are going to be somebody who moves money, please move it wisely, right? And that moving of money wisely requires a whole new set of measurements to be created for what success looks like systemically. And it requires a rebalancing of our relationships so that they become generative and not extractive. That's the relationship from the funder to the people running the organization, from the people running the organization to the people working for the organization, and from the people working at the organization to the people that it's meant to serve and or empower. You notice that my hand was going down as I did that? That's a problem. That's how we consider it. We consider that decision-making and power is up here, and then there's like a trickling down of little crumbs until it gets like the tiny little crumblet gets to the people who are actually best situated to solve the problem, which are the people who are on the ground in community on the front lines of the problem. So the thing to ask ourselves, and particularly those of you who appear to be students in the crowd, who are going to be the architects of our future, no pressure, the thing for you to think about, I think, and for all of us to think about is, how do we reorder those relationships? How do we move the locus of decision making closest to the problem? And how, instead of my hand going down, could it go across or in a circle or something like that? Until those higher order relationships are rebalanced, we're going to have an extractive system that no amount of like meditation and yoga, which are practices that I do and believe in, by the way, as ways to restore, but none of that individual level self-care, no amount of meetings missed because I need like some mental health time, is going to actually fill the gap that's necessary for us to be whole, because we have to actually reorder how our organizations work writ large. So that small task is my invitation. And I have another equally cheerful invitation, maybe even more so, which is in response to, there was a gentleman here in the last session who said, can we do this work, particularly people from historically marginalized communities, or communities that are not part of the power structure currently, can we do this work without getting stomped? And my response to that would be no. Not only can historically marginalized communities not do the work without being stomped, none of us can. It's just the degree of stomping, essentially, right? And so that doesn't feel encouraging. So what do we do then, right? If we think back to the civil rights movement, there was an acknowledgement that in order to change the status quo, the most marginalized group, or the marginalized group that was seeking its rights at the moment, would need to build allies from folks who were part of the status quo, right? Part of the plan around doing the marches and remaining nonviolent was to gain the attention of northern white liberals who could be of assistance in shifting the status quo. And I think we have a moment right now, since the events with George Floyd and those that came before and followed have created a new awareness among white people, quite frankly, we have a moment when there's a new allyship, a new depth of allyship that can be creative and that created, and that can be protective, that cannot eliminate the stomping, but can potentially reduce it. So that's a big topic, and I'm giving a really short little nugget about it. There's one last thing I'll say, which is that yesterday and today, a person of color asked the question about how we be more inclusive, essentially, and how we can engage in that kind of power shift. So I would invite, as a small act of healing and allyship, the white people in the room and online, the next time you're in a room like this, and it seems like maybe it could use a conversation around how we do that work in our movement, that you be the one to ask the question. Because that's a way of helping our friends who are from the marginalized community not have to be the one every time enduring that tiring experience. So that's one thing, that care for each other.
I just want to add quickly, one of my favorite lessons that Twitter taught me about allyship, which is just a friendly reminder that you do not decide that you're an ally. The group with which you intend to support will identifies that you are an ally. That's where that title comes from. And then also, if you haven't had a chance to review, I believe Google would probably show you that there is an excellent, specifically when we're talking about a spectrum of engagement around anti-racism, but I think this applies to other types of work, that there's allyship, but actually the step after that is to be an accomplice.
Yeah, there's another one too. One of my friends has a program in Denver, Colorado called Emancipation Theater. And so they use storytelling and improv to embody stories and things like that. And he also has a program called From Allyship to Abolitionist. And one of the reasons he uses that term, which is pretty obvious, is that abolitionists were fully committed and were taking risks financially, socially, all those other things. And so they were really embedded in like expanding liberation. So that's just a word to throw out there. And then the other thing that I have in mind is in this work, I was a pastor for like 10 years. And there were times where I would watch somebody die and then have to go to a meeting about cream or something in the church, like what milk will we use for Sunday's fellowship hour. And I would be spent, and there was nothing in the system that said, oh, hey, he just was with a person his own age that died, and he probably doesn't want to talk about dairy creamer right now. Because the system put a premium on exhaustion. And so there's a lot of different currencies. Like a lot of times when we talk about currency, we talk about the currency like money, you know, but there's a lot of different social currencies that people use to navigate space and to be as a passport into certain spaces. And one of them is exhaustion, frustration, burnt out, all these other things. And there's an economy based on that. And a lot of us benefit from it, and we don't admit that we benefit from it. And I have a question of what can we do to be conscious of the multiple economies and the multiple currencies that we use navigating these spaces. Because if we don't pay attention to those, it won't shift on our end, on those who are trying to expand the liberation stuff. So I would just wonder, what will we do to create a different culture where we don't value people being burnt out and things like that?
My answer is Louise's answer from earlier, which is modeling. Like I really think it's modeling, and I think that because I'm not good at it, and it's been repeatedly pointed out to me, right? So I work from home more often than not these days because a lot of the work is virtual. My wife works at the office more often than not, but every once in a while we're both home at the same time. And there was a day a few months ago where two of my beautiful, brilliant, experienced employees both made mistakes. They both made mistakes. Absolutely happens. And because of the systems we have set up, because of how long we've worked together and how well we work together, they both reached out to me and were like, bad news. I've made a mistake and I need your help, right? And I thought, this is a sign of good leadership. Don't panic, right? Like that they want to come to you. They're not afraid to come to you. That's actually a good thing, right? And with both of them, it was two totally different things, nothing we couldn't solve, right? But with both of them, we spent time, we made a strategy. I said, here's what I need from you. Here's what I can contribute to this. Here's where we need to bring in somebody else. You know, we talked about a solution. We made a plan. And at the end of the day, my wife and I were in the same room, and she pointed out that she had overheard those two conversations. And she said, I really wish you could treat yourself the way you treat the people that you supervise. And I was like, I am also my supervisor, right? And I do think that if we want to say like, I don't value that, right? And so my example is I was going to lose a ton of vacation time because I hadn't taken it in years for obvious reasons. And so I haven't been working on Tuesdays. And I think that really models for my staff and for our volunteers that like I'm taking time. I don't have to earn rest. I deserve rest because I am alive in the world, right? You don't have to do the time to do it. And so I do think that modeling and finding whatever framing it takes for you to, for me, that take care of yourself the way you take care of other people really sold. Another thing I've definitely said to other people, I had my next door neighbor about 20 years ago was a professional violinist. If you're going to share a wall, I highly recommend an orchestra level professional violinist for a next door neighbor. You wouldn't believe the way she took care of that violin. When she decided to go to college to play the violin, her mother took a lien out on the family home to buy that violin, which was hundreds of years old. The way she cared for that instrument because it was her livelihood. And in this kind of work, like this is the instrument. You're the instrument, right? So treat yourself like you're a 200-year-old violin. Your mom could lose her house if you break, try that, but I think finding a theory that works for you and a way to model that behavior and then look for it in your mentors, your colleagues, your peers, I think those are my advices for how we can make those changes.
This is more a comment. I lead a ministry called J17 Ministries that's short for John 17, Jesus' prayer for unity in the body of Christ. And so our whole function is uniting the body of Christ for a divided world, bridging ethnic gaps and generational gaps and socioeconomic gaps and denominational gaps, all those walls that divide us. And one of the comments I wanted to make was just that part of the reason that I'm up here, in addition to this conference, is that we're starting a chapter here in Salt Lake. So Steve will be helping with that. So just appreciate your well wishes for that effort.
Just a quick note of comment of like how overwhelmed with gratitude I've been for this whole event. Even in the preparation, the small amount of preparation that we've done, it's been invaluable to us. So one of the things that has really been eating away in a good way at my mind the past 48 hours or so has been so much great material on what to do in that healing conversation. And it's been noted, especially in this panel and a few other times yesterday and today, but how do we initiate that conversation? How do we find the people to bring to that conversation and really start that process, especially and even if it's possible or effective, people that are unwilling to come to that conversation. And so I'd love your insights on that. Thank you.
You start with the first person you know that should be at the conversation, and then at the end of that conversation, that end of the beginning of the inquiry to make the invitation, you say, who else should I talk to? And then you go talk to all of those people. And at the end of each of those conversations, you say, who else should I talk to? And at the end of all those other conversations, you say, who else should I talk to? And then once the list is all people you've talked to, you schedule the event. And then at the event, you say, who isn't here, who should be here? It's an overly simple answer, but it kind of works.
Totally works. And right, it's working through relationship. That's number one. Number two, I would invite you not to ask them to come to a bridging conversation. Rather, I would invite you to ask them about something that matters to them, that they'd like to convene a conversation about different people in the community about. This is actually one of the things that some folks become challenged by in what we call the bridging movement is we who are sort of the first in or the activists in this space have a bit of a different psychology and makeup than the world generally. So the things that are motivating to us are not necessarily motivating to the broader public. And so to initiate the conversation, one of the great invitations, if you want to do a group type of conversation, is after you've done what Ray just described, to ask the group what's important to it and what would it like to talk about, right? So our group a few years back, around 2016, 2017, our neighborhood teams in Cleveland, Ohio, and not Cleveland, Lorraine County, Ohio, and Toledo, Ohio did this. And I thought, they're probably going to come up with something like, a community garden, or, maybe they'll talk about some policy issue they want to change. Instead, they selected such relaxing topics as structural racism and gun policy, which is very divisive in the community. And I thought, okay, well, that's what the community wants to talk about. We'll roll with it. And the conversations were extraordinary. In the structural racism conversation, we had a police officer who was white in communication as part of the group with a young African-American woman who had 3 brothers who had been incarcerated in circumstances that could very well be deemed structural racism circumstances. And in that conversation, at the end of it, they agreed to work together to address local structural racism problems within the police department. And that was not like a short or easy road, right? Like the police officer started diametrically opposed. And by the end of the conversation, his statement was, I've never looked at it that way. Seeing it through your eyes changes everything for me, right? And so I just say that to say, when we start with bridging as the invitation, we can hit a dead end really quickly because there's a smaller set of people who find that as a compelling action. It's like if you're inviting people to work on environmental issues, you don't invite them to volunteer, and then that's it. You say, would you like to save the planet? And then, oh, by the way, this is how you do it. Please come to this volunteering event, right? So I would recommend doing that similarly in addition to working through relationships.
Also have great food. I know it seems silly, but she said it out when, in the earlier panel, she was talking about, there had to be food to invite people to the conversation, but really, have great food whenever possible, compensate people for their time. And like for us, that might look like public transit passes and Starbucks gift certificates just out on the table for anyone to take as much as they need, you know, if possible, stipends, like showing people that you value their time can also be really huge. And if you can't do any of those things, simply having great food will help. More people show up next time when people are like, I heard you had great snacks. Sorry, I know you don't want to talk about it.
I just mention one more thing. Just a different entry point could also be like you're being faced with it in front of you, right? You're going to a meeting at UVU around, you know, let's go ahead and do this thing. But what about the people of color? What about this other group that isn't being involved? You're like noticing, wait, something is wrong. Let me express it. As you express it, is the system actually responding to it in ways that is addressing it? Something just doesn't feel complete. It feels like I need to do something. And that's when like, you know, you use your agency to like disrupt, right? And you might be like, hey, can we just do this? We don't care about it. Well, what if I write about it, right? And in the case of like an organization I was working with in Salt Lake, my friend published an op-ed around how one of our board members owned a private prison company for profit for undocumented migrants. And they were sitting at one of the largest nonprofits in the region, really, not just the state, as a board member, right? And we're like, that's not okay. And then that meant that we had to do a lot of conflicts in you know, at the organization and be like, hey, what's going on? This is not okay. We need to talk about it. We're not comfortable. This is not enough. We don't feel like this is actually addressing it. So we need to escalate it. And if not, where are my sources of power, right? And so sometimes they're going to be like, no, okay, where else can I go? Who else can I find, right? And when you get into those points, then also those entry points look a little bit different. Like we've had some conflicts with people from other movements. And we've been like, we're not happy with each other right now, but we know we want to work with each other. We know we are important to each other in the ecosystem that we're in. Let's talk. Why don't we build an agenda together? And let's make it a start, and let's meet up on our backyards, and like, you know, we'll do potluck, and let's just discuss. And we pre-agreed what we want to talk about. We talk about it and how we're feeling, you know, and if not, then let's have a follow-up, right? But like, there's also that other part of like you as an agent being in contact with the contradictions in the system and being like, this is not okay.
This might have already like partially been answered, but earlier in the panel, two of you mentioned having like speaking to your cousins, right? And outside of like online forums, sometimes when I have a question that deals with like the lived experience of someone from a marginalized identity, I find it very difficult to like find the answer to that question because I'm not going to go and ask them. I don't want to place that burden on them, right? If someone volunteers information or their perspective or their experience, especially when it entails trauma, like I see that as a gift that they're willing to give to me, but it's not something that I feel comfortable asking for. Hasn't always been that way. I had to learn that lesson the hard way, and I'm glad that I did. But so like my question is, when that arises, when you feel like, you know, maybe I'm working on a project that is dealing with conflict and I really need input from this identity or from this group, be able to have the full picture, like how can you ask for that or contrive that or inspire that response without being disrespectful, without unduly placing a burden on those people to share experience that could be like re-traumatizing, right? Or just show complete ignorance or insensitivity to their experience.
I'm going to give you a little bit of a non-answer because I think that my co-panel might have different, stronger answers. if that were when that is happening for me, that for me is information that I am not the person for this work. So if I don't have a deep enough connection, if I've not been invited into the space, if I'm just over here thinking maybe these people want me to do this thing for them, and I don't have an email address for somebody that could get me an introduction, I don't think that's my labor. And and so I think that for me is just a time for sitting down. That's my first answer. There are other approaches that I think colleagues might have for you, but that's the first answer for me sometimes.
Just a quick answer, like if I was in that situation, and I've been in that situation, like let's say we're working with a group from an indigenous community and I just don't know what to do. I think I have a community of colleagues, a community of care with like just people with whom we're trying to do this stuff, and I can be like, hey, would you have a moment to talk? I'm trying to do this stuff and it'll be really helpful. Do you have time? And many times people will be open to support, right? Now it's a little bit more complicated if you're trying to ask a person within the conflict itself, because then you're asking them to do labor for themselves and also for others. And so when there's a little bit of distance, I think it helps. Also, point out that I also have to do the same thing with white folks. I need my white people whispered. Like what's going to help with this thing? Because I don't know. They seem to be pretty entrenched in that. And like, it also happens as well with questions around gender too. Like I'm a cis hetero male living in a patriarchal society, and we're trying to work with a group that is very white but also very queer. How do we navigate this? Considering we come from a Latinx culture that is very macho driven, I'll be like, hey, do you have a moment to talk to me, like another friend? So I don't know. It's probably not the most sophisticated answer, but it's what I've done practically.
Yeah, kind of building on the two responses so far, I think to Ray's point, it can also be a signal that there's a step to take that precedes, and it depends on the timeline for what you're working on. But ideally, if you're working on something that impacts a community and you need that input, ideally they have not just been invited to the table, but they've invited to co-build the table. And this goes back to sort of this thing about reordering our relationships and how we do healing in a context where our relationships are balanced and not patriarchal or hierarchical. And so I think step one is make sure that everybody whose opinion you're going to need is co-building from the very start. And if you don't know how to find those people, working through relationships is always the best way to just keep asking, well, who knows whom? And then it's making sure that the relationship isn't extractive. A lot of this work has to move at the speed of trust. And if you are coming authentically with a desire to make a change that is going to be beneficial to the community that you seek to engage, it may take a few conversations. It may take some vulnerability, and it may take hearing about other relationships that have not been healthy, right? That person has been subjected to, that were transactional, that were extractive, right? It's like, if a person has had an experience of being treated in a way that's extractive and that is transactional, then the next time somebody comes around to ask for help, that's what they're expecting. And it's going to take a little while to earn the trust that you might have a different approach. So I think being willing to walk that journey is important so that you're in authentic relationship. And some of the very tactical things that Ray mentioned around compensating people's time, All right. Like that's really important. A lot of times we ask for the opinions of community that go into grant proposals, that go into fund work, that we get paid to do the work surrounding, and yet those are people that are just subjects that we're serving and yet not part of the compensation structure. So it's rebalancing that as well and making sure we are truly looking at that and not being extractive and compensating time. And I get the heart of your point, and I appreciate the sensitivity of the heart of your point, which is not wanting to be the person who's asking another person from a marginalized community to do your work for you, right? To do your historical research or your awareness for you, which is what I think folks often find extractive. But I also want to invite you to not let that dissuade you from building authentic relationships that are not extractive and that help both of you learn and work together to heal those divisions.
I hope my question is relevant for this occasion. So the anti-Asian crimes increased tremendously in recent years. Some reports say maybe by 300%. What are the reasons and any remedies?
I'm going to say quickly that I'm thinking a lot about I absolutely don't know the answer to your question, which means it's a very good one, right? Not because I don't know the answer, but like I think it's a hard question, right? We're all sitting with it. And the number you're reflecting is the number I've also heard. And I think that part of the why behind that is inside the othering and the identity-based action and the fear and like people operating from a place of fear, right? I mean, I think that those are the catalysts that we see at play in in this particular, like very specific violence that you're naming. And I don't know what the solution is, but my hope is that there are some solutions in the things we've talked about over the past 2 days. And I'm going to let my colleagues answer further.
Yeah, it's a big question, and I will not pretend to have the entire answer or more than even just a little slice of response. But it's an important question, as Ray mentioned, and I think at least part of the answer is not dissimilar from a lot of the increasing violence and othering that we're seeing recently, which is that there is a narrative and there is a sort of division industrial complex, to reapply that term, pushing the narrative that there are scarce resources that people who are other than us want to take away from us. And that for those Americans who have been working hard and not seeing fruits of their labor, right? We've seen in this country our GDP go up. We've seen our CEO pay go up. We've seen our worker pay go down. So that just is an experience that many Americans are having, that the things that they were told would make a certain kind of life are not making that kind of life for themselves. And there's an explanation being provided by that division industrial complex that's because people who aren't like you are trying to take that away from you. And so there's a lot more I could say about that, but I'll just leave that there. And I will say that there is no one simple solution, certainly, but the young man earlier who raised the question about inclusion, part of his comment was, I hate politics. And if we want to solve these problems, I think it's really important that we separate politics and the political system and government and voting from the behavior of people who are in elected positions or who are part of the political industrial complex. And I say that as somebody who worked as part of that for many years. And the reason that's important is because none of us are outside of our politics, actually. Non-participation in our politics has real-world impact. So if we are to address division, and if we are to reduce violence, and if we are to mute the voice of the division industrial complex, we need to do that by putting our voices together. So one way that we can put our voices together is by having these healing conversations, one-to-one, in groups, by sewing our groups together, by connecting the relationships that we're building to structure that helps us build into a movement, and strategy that helps that movement develop tactics that create real-world results that shift the balance of power and start to show up both in our policy and in how our communities conduct themselves. So it's not like a quick and easy answer, but I do think that there are concrete steps that we can take to help reduce that violence and the violence that many communities are experiencing, whether it's actual physical violence or it's manifests itself in other ways.
I think one other application here that has been mentioned several times during the conference is that, especially in the case of this issue, extremely important to understand history, treatment. While racism is common, really deal with it, you have to deal with racism, blacks, racism. Each has its own structure, its own set of problems. Extremely important. So many emphasize that. It's really important to look at the specific, that particular situation, why it is occurring, beyond just the general violence. That is a specific type of violence has to be specific. We appreciate your touring with us. This, to me, has been a marvelous conference because of the content, because of your involvement. We cannot express adequately those of you. Yes. I come away from this, all kinds of how side.